Good morning and welcome to the EUMENIA Jean-Monnet Network lecture series. Today we'll be talking about EU-Middle East relations, an introduction. My name is Michelle Patch and I'm Professor in Global Studies at the Department of Social Sciences and Business at Roskilde University in Denmark. As you can see in the few minutes we have, we will be looking at the concepts and some theoretical reflections about exactly what we mean when we talk about the European Union and when we talk about the Middle East, but also some formative discussions in academia about how we understand this relationship, not least when we talk about the EU's role as a global actor, particularly its normative power. So we will then analyze EU-Middle East relations over the decades up to this day, and finish off with some questions and an assignment. So in terms of concepts, I would like to first make us reflect a little bit about what do we actually mean when we talk about Europe and the EU, the European Union, and what do we really understand when we refer to this region called the Middle East. Some of the more theoretical work that can help us understand these concepts is referred to as regionalism. But we also have some clear perceptions and constructions of this region, and therefore would like to share with you some reflections on discursive constructivism as a conceptual tool. And then we will focus a little bit more on how the development of the EU as a global actor came to be termed as a normative power, particularly, of course, in the Middle East region. So let's start a little bit by what we mean by the EU. Now, as we all know, concepts are controversial, particularly when we have such a broad term like Europe. Initially, it referred to this mythological figure of the beautiful daughter of a Phoenician king named Europa. Its geographical designation at the time stood for mainland Greece. By 500 BC, the meaning of Europa was extended to lands to the north. Then by the 9th century, the term Europe was first used for a cultural sphere in the Carolingian Renaissance. From that time, Europe described the Western Church's sphere of influence, in contrast to the Islamic world and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Then over the centuries, Europe expanded eastwards and included much of the Orthodox Church's territories, codified by the Soviet Geographical Society in 1958, and their decision then to consider the Ural Mountains and the Ural River across the Black Sea and further down along the Bosphorus as the border between Europe and Asia. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I and the consecutive founding of the Republic of Turkey in 1923 led to major disputes and struggles about whether, for instance, Turkey was part of Europe, the Middle East, or both. As a member of NATO, the Council of Europe, and an accession candidate of the European Union, it is largely accepted that Turkey is part of Europe as a political entity, and together with Israel is also a member of the European Football Association, UEFA. In the end, it is impossible to find a clear definition for Europe that includes and excludes territories, people, and worldviews in a proper and universally accepted way. However, if we look at the concept of the European Union, this is much easier to comprehend, since here the number of member states clearly defines the EU's territorial extension, and the acquis communautaire gives a clear framework for EU policies, its positions, and its values, which we will be talking about later. Let's move now to what we mean briefly by the Middle East. Now, this was a term that was popularized in 1957 through the Eisenhower Doctrine and the strategic handling of the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Before these events, the Near East and the Middle East were used to describe various parts of the Ottoman Empire. Renowned Egyptian philosopher Hassan Hanafi criticized the use of the Middle East as a projection from outside, not emerging from inside, and thus part of a circle of Eurocentrism, suggesting that the Muslim world as the most important term instead. This obviously is problematic as well, because while Arabic is the predominant language across the Middle East and North Africa area, and most citizens in the region are ethnic Arabs, there are still important exceptions to the rule, not least Israel, Turkey, and Iran, but also if we think about the Kurds, the Amazigh, and also Nubians. So these latter cases are often neglected and almost invisible others in constructions of the Middle East. So if we move closer to our times, we know that the Middle East has become a highly politicized term and is often used and adopted by countries in the region themselves. Think, for example, of the Middle East Airlines, which is Lebanon's flag carrier, or the daily newspaper Al-Sharq al-Awsat. So here are two examples where we refer to the region politically, economically, and socially as a constructed region. Now, in more political circles, the term Middle East entered daily terminology in diverse forms, including the Greater Middle East, the Broader Middle East, and the Islamic Middle East, especially after September the 11th. So let's look a little bit at how the idea of EU-Middle East relations came about. Before I talk a little bit more about the policies of the EU towards this region, I would briefly like to note the concept of regionalism. So we need to think about how the idea of the Middle East is constructed as a region. It is important to conceptually understand that writers have been working on the study of international cooperation and integration for some time, and they have traditionally focused on the economic or political forces that have served to push states together to form a political whole or a community, sharing common values about how the international society should be ordered in a peaceful manner. In the academic literature, therefore, various approaches to the study of integration emerged. For instance, federalism, functionalism, pluralism, and even neo-functionalism. In the case of the European project, neo-functionalism has been specifically applied to guide the theoretical study of the integration process. So neo-functionalists assume that the notion of spillover is a process of integration where a given action related to a specific goal creates a situation in which the original goal can be assured only by taking further actions, which in turn create a further condition and the need for more action. In the case of EU-Middle East relations, the European Union assumes that if the Middle East is economically developed, then political reform will follow. And this is something that my colleague Daniela Huber touches upon in her lecture on democracy promotion. So there is another assumption here that Europe's successful model of regional integration, especially since the Second World War, has been an important backbone in the making not only of EU foreign policy, but also in the way that it comports its relations with the outside world, not least in our case with the South. So the idea of North-South integration, but also the encouragement of South-South integration is quite important in the way the EU conducts its relations with the Middle East. When we talk of the discursive constructivism in EU discourse on the Middle East, we are looking at how constructions of the Middle East in specific EU discursive practices, including, for instance, policy documents and speech acts by EU actors, how these are reflected in the actual EU policies towards the area, which we now come to. So, if we look at the European Mediterranean Partnership, what we discover is that we have a number of recurring themes in the way the EU constructs the region. So the EU is often depicting the Middle East as an insecure zone, an unstable zone. It is also a very important region for the supply of oil, gas, and fuel, not least, of course, from countries like Algeria. But there's also a very important trade relationship that has to do with weapons of mass destruction and also arms, that, as Daniela Huber says in her lecture, goes back and forth often between individual member states of the EU and individual members of the Mediterranean region. There is another discourse that is prominent in the EU's making of the Middle East, and this is about the inherent violent approach in political extremism and also terrorist attacks coming from individuals emanating from groups from the region and now especially in European areas. But there are other concerns that create a specific negative discourse of the Middle East in European discourses. This has to do not least with conflicts that are ongoing, especially the Middle East conflict and also the conflict in the Western Sahara. But we also have an inherent imagination of the other, the Middle East as the other and not like us. So there is an important geopolitical imagination here. And this is where the EU came up with 3 pillars of its Mediterranean partnership. So it has the political pillar, the economic pillar, and then the social pillar. In this way, the EU has tried to establish a more regional approach to how all of the European Union member states comport with their relations with Middle Eastern partners of this partnership. Now, I briefly want to say something about the way that this idea and this construction of the Middle East comes. You have probably heard of the notion of the EU as a civil power or a civilian power or a soft power or a normative power. Now, these are quite similar, but I'll go through each in a step-by-step approach. So when we talk about the EU as a civilian power, we're looking at how it aims at achieving specific normative objectives, for example, a more democratic Middle East, so as to shape the international environment. So the assumption is that if the Middle East is more democratically inclined to the European way of democracy, then we have a more stable international environment. Now, this has led to more discussions on this notion where we talk about soft power. So how can the EU persuade its Middle East partners to comport themselves along the same model of the EU? So those who speak of the EU as a soft power are referring to its ability to influence others with non-military means. So in its relations with the Middle East, the EU does this on an everyday basis. For example, it requires those who wish to do business with Europe, so in trade relations, Middle Eastern countries have to follow certain standards and regulations. Observers argue that the EU's soft power actually works. So there is a kind of magnetic attraction of the EU as the world's largest market. Just think of the millions of people who would like to come and live and work in the EU. Just think about the countries that over the decades have queued and are still queuing to join the EU as full members if they are so eligible. Just think of the welfare system in the EU, which is often the envy of many people around the world. Just think about the International Criminal Court or the Kyoto Protocol, which probably without the EU's engagement would not be there. So specifically in regard to the Middle East, we need to think about how the EU promotes human rights around the world. And if there was no EU, would this actually be a policy that others would follow? Think, for instance, of different presidents in the US, but also other international actors like China or Russia, who don't really give priority to the issue of democracy promotion or human rights in their relations with the Middle East. So this brings us to normative power. Now, the EU, when depicted as a normative power, is often said to be a distinct institution, especially in terms of its role in world politics. So, for example, former High Representative Javier Solana commented, "The EU has responsibility to work for the global common good. That is a fitting way of describing the EU's global role and its ambition." The term normative power comes from a piece that was written by Ian Manners in the Journal of Common Market Studies, where he defines normative power as the way in which the EU changes the norms the standards and the prescriptions of world politics, away from bounded expectations of state centricity, which are generally acknowledged within the UN system to be universally applicable. So in other words, we're looking at how the power of ideas and the ideation that the EU has in terms of its role in world politics impacts upon its relations with the Middle East. This brings us now to a second important policy of the EU's relations with the Middle East, which is termed the European Neighbourhood Policy. Now, because of the often challenges that the EU met with the European Mediterranean Partnership, the EU decided to perhaps focus more on bilateral relations with these countries of the Middle East. And that is why we are looking at a push, perhaps, and a move from the EMP, which was more a kind of normative regionalism policy, to a more normative bilateral policy. And the challenges, of course, do not disappear, but the regional dimension was constructed as problematic because these countries of the Middle East were deemed to be moving along different trajectories in what the EU was trying to do with promoting especially state behavior by way of human rights recognitions and democracy. So the emphasis in all the ENP documents is again on democracy and human rights, rule of law, the market economy, sustainable development, again stability, security, and also joint responses to common challenges in order for the EU to establish a more prosperous region towards the south. So what we have is that the idea came across that across different policy sectors, for example, trade policy, there is an implicit understanding that the economic development will bring prosperity, which will, in turn will bring peace and stability in the southern neighborhood as a whole. So this time, the ENP was purposefully devised as a bilateral program, but retained a key component of the previous Euro-Mediterranean policy, and that is its normative dimension. This brings us to a core aspect in EU relations with the Middle East. We are talking about huge dilemmas here. What does the EU do? Does it promote values? But what about its interests? So what does the EU prioritize? Does it collaborate with authoritarian regimes in order to ensure some form of stability? Or does this come at the expense of human rights? Does it have to be an either-or policy priority situation, or can the EU do both? This brings us to the Union for the Mediterranean. Now, despite all the challenges that the EU faced with the EMP and the ENP, a third policy came into effect, which was launched at the Paris Summit for the Mediterranean in 2008. And this builds on the EMP, which was also called the Barcelona Process of 1995, and it also builds on the ENP. Now, the Barcelona Declaration set to achieve a political and security partnership, an economic and financial partnership, as we said, and a social and cultural and human partnership. So the setting of the Union for the Mediterranean enhanced cooperation in the Mediterranean and gave it fresh impetus. In addition to the 27 EU member states and the 10 southern Mediterranean partners, there is also the involvement of Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Monaco, Montenegro, and Mauritania, which joined the cooperation. It is headquartered in Barcelona, and the UFM works on very concrete projects, such as, for example, depollution of the Mediterranean Sea, maritime and land highways, and solar energy projects. So regional research programs are also included here. Moving on, and I know that Daniela Huber touches upon the Arab uprisings in her lecture, but I just want very briefly to talk about how the Tunisian uprising of 2010 ushered what seemed to be a new political phase in the Arab world, namely the beginnings of the unraveling of Arab autocracy, which has been a key dilemma for the EU in its relations with the Middle East. However, as we know, what happened in Tunisia, even though it rippled over into Egypt and also Syria, Libya, and Yemen and other countries of the Middle East, 10 years on, this trajectory is yet to take hold region-wide, and prospects for democratic transitions are really uncertain. Tunisia, on the one hand, may be considered a successful case that is going along the democratic path that the EU conceives in its relations with the Middle East. But Egypt has regressed into entrenched authoritarianism under al-Sisi, and unfortunately, Syria, Yemen, and Libya have actually turned into civil wars that are intertwined with outside military intervention. So we have a truly tragic situation. So where do we stand? Does the EU strategy towards the Middle East bypass demands and wishes of the local Middle East and North African populations? After all, these people have asked for justice, dignity, and freedom. So are we back to square one? In other words, is the EU really interested in its interests rather than its values? This brings us to some questions and an assignment. So to start with, you have the question of what are the key limitations and dilemmas of the EU's relations with Middle Eastern countries. Here you need to talk about this notion of values and interests on the one hand, but also whether we might have some genuine normative ideas that are extremely hard to implement, because there are, of course, also factors that emanate from the Middle East, not least corruption and authoritarian regimes that are very keen to sustain their power. The second question, does the EU exert any influence in the Middle East region? Well, you could argue that to some extent it does, for example, in trade relations. But if you look at different policy areas, you know that there are serious challenges when it comes to, for instance, encouraging democratic reform. Thirdly, have the EU strategic partnerships with the Middle East materialized into the anticipated socio-economic development in the latter? Here, of course, you'll need some data from, for example, the OECD to consider whether some of these countries have actually developed socio-economically. There was a very interesting article in The Guardian on the case of Tunisia, where Tunisians themselves were saying that in spite of the Arab uprising, the everyday economic situation of many people in Tunisia remains dire, not least the unemployment levels, for example, of many of its youth, which is highly educated and yet remains unemployed. Finally, if we take a policy analytical approach, we can ask the big question, can the EU revive the Middle East peace process? This is a thorn in EU-Middle East relations, and our colleague Dimitri Bouris has written a very interesting piece on this that we will be happy to give further reference to. So here now I've given you some very broad references of the literature. The literature is not exhaustive by all means. It's a very topical subject and many have written about it, but these are just some suggestions. And then finally, I'd like to thank you. And also I would encourage you to look at our website, which has other interesting videos, not only by lectures, but also by prominent policymakers that can help you understand the challenges that continue in EU-Middle East relations.